And at 10, 8 Aunt May and Mary Jane. Okay, so technically this is Spider-Man, but it's a zombie version of Spider-Man, but I'm gonna count it anyway because this is pretty damn messed up, zombie or not. On Earth 2149, an alien plague ends up infecting all superpowered individuals and turns them into zombies. However, it's later revealed that the Necronomicon from Evil Dead was actually what caused it. But after learning that the plague was actually like a bad thing, Peter ran home to get Aunt May and MJ the hell out of Dodge. But when he gets there, we get a good old case of protagonist syndrome and boom! Zombie Spider. He ends up becoming a zombie and eats the two most important people in his life. He also had a fractured jaw before becoming a zombie, so I'm sure you can imagine that this isn't a pretty sight, even by zombie standards. It may not be our Pete, but it was a version of Spider-Man, so it's fine. And at 9, Anna Marconi. Speaking of a version of Spider-Man, let's discuss the Superior Spider-Man and his fascination with Anna Marconi. Superior Spider-Man is actually Otto Octavius, who prior to the Superior Spider-Man storyline had brain swapped with Peter, yet a piece of Peter still remained in his own body, which convinced Otto to end up becoming a hero, albeit a darker one. Doc Ock was up to some really shady stuff while pretending to be Peter, cause you know, since Peter is young, handsome, in shape, and has actual women in his life, Otto tried his luck at getting MJ to sleep with him, but failed miserably. So, you know, things weren't going that well. But then there's Anna Marconi, whom this Otto-Peter hybrid started dating. She had no idea what the real situation was going on inside that noggin, and while it's unclear if they ever actually hopped on the good foot and did the bad thing, it's obvious that things were at least heading in that direction. Otto was in love with her, which was a surprise since he even decided to give Peter back his body to save her, but it was still an absolutely horrific story, immoral, in the highest class of the word. It's creepy as hell and it makes me rethink all relationships. And at 8, interfered with surgery. In the same series as the Anna Marconi situation, the small bit of Peter that was left in his body was trying to regain control, for obvious reasons, because you know, a super villain was piloting his bone mech with meat armor. This small bit of Peter though was at times able to interfere or even control Otto temporarily. One of these moments came in Superior Spider-Man number 8, where there was a device that was capable of wiping Pete from Otto's brain, but to get it he had to perform surgery on a little girl. However, Peter didn't think that Otto could do it, so he tries to stop Otto from even performing the surgery, while he has his Spider-Man mask on, may I add, and an additional face mask, so if evil Spider-Man can do it, so can you. Even still, trying to prevent the surgery to save a little girl's life is a pretty low moment for the Barnacle, even if it was filled with good intentions. Kind of. Those only power crystals, you know. Actually, is that how it works? I don't know. I don't think like Topaz is gonna cure my depression or something. And in 7, scarring Harry Osborn. While Spider-Man 3 in and of itself is one of the most despicable things that Spider-Man has done, well, with the exception of that sweet dance scene, one of the most horrible things actually in the movie is during the final fight between Harry and Peter. Peter shows up at Harry's house wearing the black symbiote costume and is mad about Goblin Jr. being the reason that MJ left Peter. However, this fight is about more than that, since Harry still blames Peter for killing his father, and Peter is done trying to convince him. After wailing on him a little bit, Peter kicks Harry into the path of a rogue glider, sending him flying into a shelf of good old-fashioned pumpkin bombs. After some mental torment, he knocks Harry out against the wall, at least so he thinks. But in fact, Harry is awake, and as Peter is walking away, Harry decides to chuck a pumpkin bomb at Pete, who dodges it thanks to his spider sense, but then thanks to the symbiote throws it back at Harry, causing it to explode basically right next to his face. If it weren't for the Goblin Serum, Harry would definitely be dead, and honestly, even with it, I'm surprised that he survived. But you do have to admit, it was pretty damn cold, but Harry also did kind of deserve it. And at 6, assorted killings. For being a hero that has a strict no killing rule, Spider-Man has killed quite a few people, but perhaps most notably Logan's friend Charlie in the graphic novel Spider-Man vs. Wolverine from 1987. The plot of this is that both Wolverine and Spidey end up in Berlin for their own reasons, and as the title suggests, Wolverine and Spider-Man end up fighting each other, in a graveyard to be exact. The fight is actually a good one, with Spidey even having the mindset to kill Wolverine because Logan might kill him first. They don't know each other that well at this point. The fight ends only when a helicopter of bad guys shows up looking for Logan's friend Charlie. Wolverine wanted to help his friend stop killing, but now since this helicopter showed up, Wolverine wants to kill her quick, since, you know, they aren't going to. Which he doesn't actually have to do because Spider-Man does. After Charlie intentionally sets off his spider sense and gets a super powered spider punch to the face, killing her instantly. Halfway through into number 5, kissed Gwen's daughter. After learning that your father isn't actually your father, but rather your mother's ex who she cheated on with his worst enemy, what do you think you would do? Also, you're aging more rapidly because your real father has some form of goblin serum in his system that somehow passed on to you, but you only age up physically, so you're mentally 10 with the body of an adult. yeah, you may want to skip this number. Since Pete and Sarah end up getting closer after fighting off dealers in Paris, but this was made even worse when they're in Paris without MJ, who Peter didn't bring for whatever reason. The thing is though, Peter thinks that this is entirely platonic. This just goes to show you that if your partner thinks that someone's trying to get with you, you should listen. Because lo and behold, Sarah ends up planting one on her almost dad, just as MJ shows up for a surprise visit. And I think the name of the storyline, Sins Remembered, is way too fitting and is definitely going to be seared into my brain now. God damn it. You thought that Gwen and Green Goblin was bad? Oh boy. And it forestalled his marriage. After siding with Tony in the events of the first Civil War, Spider-Man has to reveal his identity to the world in order to continue fighting crime. And you know, since now every supervillain on Earth knows how to get to Spider-Man, Kingpin ends up attacking Peter at his home. He dodges the bullets, but they end up hitting Aunt May instead, putting her in critical condition. This is the start of the One More Day storyline, probably the most universally hated Spider-Man run of all time. Since in order to save Aunt May, Peter talks to Mephisto and ends up selling his marriage to MJ in order to save his aunt. So their entire marriage will get erased so that he can have at least one more day with his aunt. Aside from living with the consequences of your actions, because you know, that's not what heroes do. Which is also pretty goddamn horrible. You wanna know what else is pretty goddamn horrible? Like, MJ had to agree to it as well, or at least she had to say that she did. But like, seriously, if you're being realistic, okay? How many years does Aunt May really have left? Okay, like, honestly, not many. So selling your marriage to bring back your one foot in the grave aunt just seems like a not so even trade to me. I'm just saying. MJ's gonna be around for longer. You heard it right, ladies. I'd let my old aunt die for you. Hit me up. Getting close to the end into number 3, One Moment in Time. The One Moment in Time story comes after the One More Day story, and this seems to be the storyline that No Way Home is taking inspiration from. However, after saving Aunt May, Wilson Fisk ends up sending a hitman after MJ's Aunt Anna Watson, but the hitman, revealed to be Eddie Brock, ends up attacking Mary Jane. Peter takes the wounded MJ to Doctor Strange, who heals her, but Peter also insists that Doctor Strange performs a spell that causes everyone to forget that he's Spider-Man, because again, not living with the consequences of his actions. Strange contacts Iron Man and Mr. Fantastic for advice, and they end up agreeing with him eventually. They do, however, decide that nobody should remember who Peter is aside from Peter. Not Doctor Strange, not Tony, not Mr. Fantastic, not MJ. But Peter, being Peter, jumps out of his protective bubble and grabs MJ and pulls her in before the spell is complete. They wake up in a motel and Peter explains what happened. Mary Jane asks why he couldn't just let her forget, and then she explains that she can't be with him because it's only a matter of time before somebody rips off his mask again and they go after her family, and that's a danger that she can't let happen. Back in the present though, Mary Jane also explains that he has to move on and find somebody who can be with him. Should've just let her forget it, man. Penultimately, into number 2, Hit Mary Jane. To get things straight, I understand that finding out that you're actually a clone and that the real Peter Parker has been living his life for the past few years as Ben Reilly because he thought he was the clone would be pretty earth-shattering, but nonetheless, it doesn't excuse this behavior. You may be under a lot of stress, but you never hit or take it out on your partner in any way whatsoever. No matter what gender you are or aren't, you just don't, okay? But Peter didn't get that memo for a minute, since in the Clone Wars storyline after finding this out, Peter and Ben are in the middle of a scrap. Mary Jane admittedly doesn't make the brightest move though when she attempts to break the two up, but Peter instinctively backhands her across the room, a moment we see referenced in Spider-Man 3 in the cafe that MJ works at. However, in the comic, Mary Jane was actually currently pregnant with his child, and while Peter does instantly regret this and is filled with shame and guilt, he runs away. He doesn't check on his pregnant wife. He flees and joins up with Jackal, so yeah. Not the finest moment there, dude. Finally, into number 1, Killed Mary Jane. I know I say I hate talking about this, but honestly, if I have to suffer through this knowledge, so does everyone else. It's like my own way of being a supervillain. In the Spider-Man Reigns storyline, it's revealed that Mary Jane is dead, but it's also revealed later on why she's dead, since she was married to Peter, and as I've mentioned, did eventually want to have kids with him. The thing is though, a radioactive spider biting your hand does more to a man than lets him stick to walls and perform incredible acrobatics. It also fills that man with radiation, and anything else he feels also gets filled with radiation, if you catch my drift. Whether you're role-playing a lab experiment or not, that's what ended up happening after all, since Mary Jane ends up dying of cancer thanks to the radiation that Peter was packing in those swimmers. Yeah, it's absolutely horrible, and while yes, it's a question that everyone had, it's not something we ever wanted an answer to, especially if this is the way that it was gonna go.
First off, we have Spider-Man's infamous deal with the devil in the super controversial storyline One More Day featuring the demonic villain Mephisto. While a lot of the entries on this list deal with alternate universe versions of Peter Parker that have gone to the dark side, the Marvel 616 universe Spider-Man has had his fair share of dark mistakes as well. After Aunt May was mortally wounded by an assassin's bullet and all other forms of magical intervention had been exhausted, Peter is approached by Mephisto in the guise of a little girl who offers to save Aunt May in exchange for one thing: Peter and Mary Jane's marriage. While Peter and MJ had noble reasons for accepting the deal, making contracts with demons is definitely a more villainous action than most heroes would take, and has led to many unforeseen consequences in Spider-Man's life ever since. In another example of the mainstream Marvel Universe's Spidey crossing a dark line, number 9 has gotta be when he fought with Daredevil to try and kill Sin Eater. Guilty of having killed Peter's one friend on the police force, Captain Jean DeWolf, Sin Eater was beyond redemption in Spider-Man's eyes, and was nearly beaten to death before Daredevil intervened. And while eventually Peter was able to see reason, he was on the verge of beating a man to death, showing just how blurry the line between supervillainry and superheroics can be. Coming in at number 8, we have the tragic death of Mary Jane Watson in the Spider-Man Reign storyline. In this alternate universe, an elderly Peter Parker gave up being Spider-Man decades ago, and has since let New York devolve into a dystopian police state, with supervillains being led by the city's mayor. The reason for this old Spider-Man's lack of action is unfortunately heartbreaking, with the love of his life, Mary Jane, having succumbed to cancer after too many years caring for a radioactive husband. And while eventually Peter finds redemption and takes back the city, it still goes to show how dark a world without Spider-Man can be. At number 7, we have Man-Spider, the horrific result of what would happen to Peter Parker if he was a bit more spider and a little less man. Man-Spider first appeared when Angel from the X-Men and Peter Parker were both captured by the villain Brainchild within the prehistoric Savage Lands. Brainchild's plan was to devolve his enemies into more primordial forms, and this left Spider-Man with a hideous appearance, even more limbs than usual, and an unstoppable murderous hunger. While he was eventually able to regain his human form without doing too much damage, every time a villain alters Peter's genetics to favor his spider side has led to massive amounts of internal strife and hunger for human flesh. Speaking of which, number 6 has us talking about the Peter Parker from the Marvel Zombies universe, and this guy's got even more of a thing for eating people than our last number. Zombie Spider-Man unfortunately was infected early on when his world began to fall to the zombie plague, bitten by a half-decapitated Captain America. Before he even really knew what was happening, this version of Spider-Man had consumed the brains of his beloved Aunt May, Mary Jane, and even J. Jonah Jameson. While still retaining most of his personality, this version of Spider-Man was motivated entirely by hunger, to the degree that he even joined in a superpowered mob to topple and devour Galactus when he visited the zombified world. Not exactly the most polite table manners, my dude. Coming in at number 5, we have none other than the Assassin Spider-Man of Earth 8351. Over the years, Spider-Man's had many different kinds of web shooters, from homemade mechanical ones to the biological ones of the Sam Raimi films, but this is probably the only version of Spider-Man where the web shooter is just a shooter, meaning it's literally just a gun. Yes, believe it or not, there's a Spider-Man that just shoots people instead of web slinging. Having abandoned New York in his own universe to become an international assassin alongside of Wolverine, this Spider-Man has entirely given up on great responsibility and seeks only to make a living far, far away from the family he left behind. At number 4, we have perhaps the most well-known occasion where Spider-Man was a villain, because he literally had a villain inside his head. That's right, it's the Superior Spider-Man. After many years of being arch rivals, Spider-Man was seemingly defeated by Dr. Otto Octavius when the dying supervillain swapped their consciousness around, leaving Peter Parker to seemingly die in the frail villain's body. While Otto was motivated by the desire to be a better, aka superior Spider-Man, his violent tactics and invasive use of Spider-Bot technology were frowned upon by most every other hero, and it was only after surrendering Peter's body back that Octavius would admit that Parker was the actual superior Spider-Man all along. Coming in at number 3, we've got the evil CEO Peter Parker from the video game Spider-Man: Edge of Time. We've been counting through a list of times that Spider-Man has changed or used his superpowers for evil throughout the multiverse, but this incarnation proves that even Spidey's alter ego can go very, very bad. After losing many of his loved ones in this universe, Peter became CEO of the Alchemax Corporation, determined to use his scientific knowledge and time travel to prevent anyone he loves from being hurt ever again in any timeline, no matter what the cost. This version of Peter has also twisted his uncle's beloved words, using the mantra, "With great powers comes great responsibility and great opportunity, and the only way to live up to all that responsibility is to use every opportunity to get all the power." At number 2, we've got Spider-Carnage, best known from Spider-Man the Animated Series, and perhaps the single deadliest multiverse variant of Peter Parker we've yet to see from Marvel. In a world where Peter had an even rougher life, with Aunt May passing away shortly after his Uncle Ben, this Peter was manipulated and abused by the cloning supervillain the Jackal into believing he was not the real Peter Parker. This mental instability was made even worse by the appearance of a Carnage symbiote from another dimension, which latched onto this Spider-Man's confusion and hatred to create Spider-Carnage, a being with endless, insane rage, but also the intellect of a genius. Spider-Carnage's one goal was to bring about an end to all possible realities, something even Thanos wouldn't consider attempting, and he was only able to be defeated by multiple Spider-Men working together to defeat their twisted variant. Finally, at number 1, we've got the death of Uncle Ben, which is perhaps the defining moment in all of Spider-Man's career. Now, I know it may be a little controversial to choose something from Spidey's origin story as the number 1 pick, especially considering how many evil multiverse stories there are, but in my opinion, one of the best aspects of Spider-Man is that he isn't perfect. Sometimes he makes mistakes, even bad ones, and it's how he reacts and learns from these mistakes that make him such a great hero. When Peter first gets his powers, he initially just wants to become famous with them, and winds up letting a thief go when his wrestling gig is barged in on. It's this thief going on to kill Uncle Ben, and Peter's realization of how badly he screwed up, that fully cements in him that with great power comes great responsibility. You don't even have a single Spider-Man story if you don't have this one villainous moment from Peter, one that he's still trying to make up for to this day, and that, in my opinion, is why it comes out on top.
Kicking off the list at number 10, Spider's Man. We'll kick off this list on an itchy note. This version of Spider-Man from Earth 11580 is actually Spider's Man. You might be asking, wait a minute Taylor, spiders? Like more than one? Oh yeah, he's actually made up of thousands of spiders that work together as if they're one person, like a hive mind. See, before that incident, that horrible incident, Peter and Gwen were visiting Horizon Labs, and instead of one spider taking a bite out of Peter's finger and then blessing him with biceps and perfect vision, he instead fell into a pit of radioactive spiders where they all consumed him, and subsequently his consciousness was spread out through all of those spiders. Hive mind, so gross. How horrible is this already? If I just got robbed and Spider's Man came to save the day, I'd be sick. Just seeing a cover of this guy on Spider-Geddon issue 3 makes me so uncomfortable. I mean, hats off to Christos Gage and George Molina for making this character one of the most unique versions. You can definitely say that, definitely unique. The Spider. Coming from Earth 15, the Spider, also known as Inmate 24739, made his first appearance in Exiles issue 12. Inmate, what's going on with that? Is Peter bad in this reality? Yeah, he's actually pretty horrible. He's a redhead who has a lot in common with Cletus Cassidy, and in turn he gets slapped with 67 consecutive life sentences by a jury. He's not as into the saving lives thing, he's rather into the opposite. He joined Weapon X after being drafted by the Timebreakers. Now, as horrible as the Spider sounds, he still feels like Peter when you read this comic. He has a similar sense of humor as Deadpool here, so it's still fun, although he's evil. Hyperion of Earth 4023 also joined, became the leader, and the Spider stood by his side as they planned on conquering multiple realities. Pete met his fate in issue 44 of Exiles when Firestar hit him with a Mega Blast. He turned into ash. Already cremated, look at that, we get to save money. And before we continue on with this list, if you want to go ahead and give us a thumbs up, that would be awesome. It really does help our nerd squad over here in our nerd base. You guys are the best. Thanks for sticking around. Let's keep going with this list. Number 8, Spider-Kid. Making his first appearance in Spider-Force issue 1, Earth 218 Peter's childhood is actually darker this time around, believe it or not. See, both of his parents passed away in a car crash, and Uncle Ben was a mean old man afterwards who was just horrible to Peter all the time. Peter actually changed his name to Charlie, and then he didn't try and be good. He actually became quite a troubled young man. He had to spend 2 years at the Administration for Child Services and then 2 more years at the Horizon Juvenile Detention Center. In order to get by, he chose to steal money from street dealers. He's not a bad kid, although I've just said that he is a few times. He just had a horrible childhood and he slipped down the wrong path. It happens. But that all changed when Charlie was recruited into the Superior Spider Army by Ashley Barton. She calls him Grandpa because he reminds her of an older Pete from her reality. He's like, yeah, I'm 13 though, please don't call me Gramps. Awesome. Coming to you live from Warp World, one of the most out there versions of Peter Parker hit the page in Infinity Wars issue 3. Moon Knight and Spider-Man are gearing up. They're making a game plan to take down Gamora. And Spider-Man says, look, just punch whoever I punch in a second. Deal? Easy peasy. That turns out to be a lot harder than imagined when the both of them merge together. Alongside Arachnite, we got to meet some other amalgams of characters. We got Ghost Panther, Soldier Supreme, Iron Hammer, and more, so much more. Peter's mind was also separated into 4 different personalities, each desiring dominance. So we have Science Pete, the Knight Pete, Friendly Neighborhood Arachnid Pete, and for when it comes to signing checks and shaking hands, we have CEO Pete. Number 6, Astro Spider. Jumping on over to Earth 3145, making his first appearance in Spider-Force issue 2, John Jameson III was an astronaut for NASA, and during one mission, a spider got trapped in his suit, which it's an absolute nightmare scenario right there. But when the space shuttle was hit by cosmic waves, John then obtained these amazing new abilities. He didn't come home and stop bank robbers one quip and whip at a time. See, this Earth was now destroyed by a thermonuclear war, so Jameson was assigned to oversee the construction of a spacecraft on the Nautilus platform. He, along with 35 others, are the last of humanity. After this cosmic mishap, John can now read minds. He can create webs of solid telekinetic energy, but he met his fate a few issues later when he was feasted on by Verna. Sometimes being a spider totem sucks. Number 5, the Savage Spider-Man. Spider-Man, but a savage. So savage. This Peter Parker entered comics in Vault of Spiders issue 1. When a plane went down over Antarctica, Peter was the only survivor out of his family. He didn't have powers yet, he didn't swing his way to freedom, but he survived by using the last parachute. During his rough emergency landing, the wind moved him around quite a bit, and unfortunately he landed in one of the worst places on the planet, a spider's nest in Savage Land. I was just done with the spider stuff, now we're back to being itchy again. They all just bit him over and over and over again, and powers of course soon followed. The Savage Spider-Man was the new protector of Savage Land. Later on, he was recruited into the Spider Army by Ghost Spider to fight off the Inheritors back on our Earth 616. Honestly, this is a great version. I love when Wilson Fisk sees the boy growing up again. See, he was the reason the plane went down in the first place those many years ago. So when he returns to see if this Savage Spider-Man is real, he gets a little payback. Number 4, Hostess Cake Spider-Man. I think it's time we talk about one of the weirdest but yummiest versions of Spider-Man. Not only is Peter dishing out quips and flips, but he's also feeding the world too. What a hero. This version was born in an ad for Hostess Twinkies, so naturally its own Marvel universe has to exist. And also, it's fun to make it exist and to think about it. When it came down to taking on villains, Spider-Man wouldn't web them up, instead he would just huck treats at them, because that always works. Twinkies, Hostess cakes, anything, you name it. Funny enough, in Spider-Verse issue 1, the cakes are referred to as golden sponge cakes so that they don't get sued. It's also the same issue where we see the end of Golden Sponge Cake Spidey. It's sad, but if he stuck around for too long, realistically, everybody would just get fat or riddled with cavities.
Spider sense tells me this cake isn't for eating. It's for throwing!
Number 3, Superior Spider. Starting in 2013, this version is the outcome of the Dying Wish storyline when Dr. Octavius planted his mind inside Peter Parker's. Nice little swap. There we go. We see this begin in Amazing Spider-Man issue 698. Peter gets a priority call from the Avengers, and when he meets them all on the raft, Cap informs him that one of his old enemies is dying, and Peter knows that it's Doc Ock before he even tells him. Cap says that he's asking for him. Well, rather, he's asking for Peter Parker. Peter goes in and he asks everybody for a private moment, just the two of them to talk it out, right? But when they're in there for that hot second, it's revealed that they somehow have switched bodies, page 20 and 22. So Peter in Doc's body is freaking out. He's worried what the hell to do, because now he's got his powers and his families and his friends are all at risk. You gotta stay away from those brain-swapping Octobots, that's the key. I'm not gonna tell you what happens because it's really enjoyable. Go check it out yourself. Number 2, Spider-Boy. Marvel and DC are powerhouses, both on page and on screen. So when the two companies combine forces, we get some pretty amazing characters like Spider-Boy. Making his first debut in Marvel vs. DC issue 3, residing on Earth 9602, Spider-Boy is an amalgam of Spider-Man and Superboy. How epic is that? Spider-Boy is a clone. Now he's a clone of Peter who was created during an accidental lab explosion. General Ross felt responsible for this explosion, so he ended up adopting the young lab lad. They were a fun duo until Ross was taken out by a mugger, so Pete then became a hero. He put together the suit, became famous almost overnight. That whole event kicked off the with great power comes great responsibility vibe. Now back when he returned to Project Cadmus, Pete was given a web pistol to help him swing around town. In this story, he doesn't have webs here, but it doesn't really matter. Because of his new superpowers, he can focus gravity inwards to make himself stronger and move faster, or he can lower gravity around himself in order to jump higher, further, and faster. He just clicks the off switch on gravity and then climbs walls. Must be nice. Guy probably kills it with wall sits. And finally, number 1, Flash, Betty, and John. For the last one on this list, we figured we'd end on a 3-in-1. What If is releasing weekly episodes on Disney Plus currently, so I have to throw it back to one of my favorite issues from Volume 1 back in the 70s. What if someone else besides Spider-Man had been bitten by the radioactive spider? Written by Don Glutt, What If Volume 1 Issue 7, we get to see Flash Thompson, Betty Brant, and John Jameson get their shot at being Spider-Man. How lucky. First, Flash gets bit, he gets the powers, and he teaches a bad driver a lesson. With his new strength, I mean, he's a little bit too harsh. The middle finger always works, but okay, rocky start, that's fine. Then he decides to take a crack at professional wrestling. He thinks it's going to be a breeze, but due to said super strength, he killed the guy instead of tapping him out. Not much of a superhero there. The Vulture ends up ending his not so hot streak, so next up we have Betty Brant. Her costume is arguably the flashiest. It makes for great photo shoots, apparently. Gotta get those likes somehow, make those superpowered TikToks, I'm here for it. But when she runs out of web fluid while striking a pose, the thief that takes Uncle Ben's life runs on by, and no one does anything about it. And finally, this issue shows us John Jameson getting his shot. While his outfit was also pretty on point, his judgment was not. John tried to stop a space shuttle from crashing and didn't live to tell the tale. Next time you feel like web swinging to work, just remember that the responsibility thing is just as important as the powers.
Number 10, Savage Spider-Man. This Spider-Man hails from Savage Land. When he was just a child, he and his parents flew over Savage Land when their plane exploded. Although his parents were killed, young Peter Parker survived. He landed in a nest of giant spiders who raised him as their own, building up his immunity to their spider venom by biting him. That's what happened. Peter Parkerman would grow up to become Savage Spider-Man, a guardian of the Savage Land, who would later be recruited to join the multiversal Spider Army in the fight against the Inheritors. Savage Spider-Man has his origins explained and was first introduced in Vault of Spiders issue number 1. Vault of Spiders. Number 9, the other old man Spider-Man. The other one. We've already talked about the senile old Spider-Man who basically goes insane in his old age and is severely depressed due to the city being overrun with corrupt politicians and criminals and due to losing Mary Jane and how that happened or why that happened. But we haven't yet talked about the old, seemingly immortal Spider-Man from Earth 18236. This version of the character is so old he doesn't even remember how long he's lived in the retirement home he now finds himself in. His life was extended after he received a blood transfusion from Deadpool, and in this alternate reality he is confined to a wheelchair while remaining impressively dexterous and strong. The old man Deadpool of this reality ends up in the same retirement home and the two team up together. I don't know about you, but I think a reality where Spider-Man is forced to team up with Deadpool, possibly forever because he can now live so long, is a pretty dark one, at least from Peter's perspective. You can find this version of Spider-Man and this version of Deadpool in their team-up series, Spider-Man/Deadpool in issue 26. And friends, before we move on to the next spot, just a quick reminder to click like, click, and do the other things too, like comment, subscribe, you know, all the things. Thank you. Number 8, Web-Slinger. The Web-Slinger is an alternate version of Spider-Man who was first introduced in Amazing Spider-Man in 2014 in issue number 9, but we'd later learn more of his origins in Vault of Spiders issue number 1. Here we discover how Patrick O'Hara and his horse Widow got got their spider-like abilities. A spider that had become exposed to an elixir bit both of them one day, granting them miraculous abilities. This elixir had been made by Patrick's colleague Dr. Michael Morbius, who made and sold elixirs and participated in a traveling show along with the gunslinger. However, Morbius was transformed into a vampire when he himself consumed the elixir and began to feed on human children. Patrick was forced to confront Morbius, who sacrificed himself in a laboratory explosion, rushing towards it instead of away to make sure that the people would be safe from him forever. Tragic. Number 7. Mayhem. Mayhem is an alternate version of another alternate version of Spider-Man. It's a lot of alternates on alternates. The alternate version they're an alternate of is Spider-Girl of the Earth 982 reality, aka MC2. Mayhem is April Parker, the clone of May Parker, Spider-Man and Mary Jane's daughter. April was initially antagonistic when she awoke from her stasis, but was soon after brought around to the side of good, and even integrated into the Parker family, becoming like a sister to May and taking the name April. At school, May explained their identical appearance by saying April was her cousin. However, April would eventually turn to the dark side once more, taking up the mantle Mayhem, after becoming jealous of May. April believed there could only be one Spider-Girl woman, Spider-Woman. Number 6. Spiders-Man, Earth X. Spiders-Man of Earth X is different from the Spiders-Man we talked about in part 3 of this series, who hailed from the Earth 11580. Spiders-Man of Earth X, or the reality of Earth 9997, is a villain who ended up joining the Skull, and used his abilities to torment the Skull's prisoners. We don't know what his life was like before, we merely know that a mutation likely caused him to turn into a lizard-like being whose skin looks similar to the pattern of Spider-Man's suit. He has illusion casting powers which allow him to cast energy webs that cause very realistic illusions, making his victims relive the most tragic moment of their lives. Number 5. Ultimatum. Miles Morales of Earth 1610 has not been integrated into the 616 world, and because of that and because of his awesomeness, we often associate him with the main continuity, but he isn't the actual Miles of Earth 616. We have one of those, as a matter of fact, who is in fact not a hero, but instead a criminal who once worked for the Kingpin. He ended up being sent to the reality of Earth 1610, but made his way back to Earth 616 eventually. Returning, he now had knowledge of the lives people had lived in 1610 before the world was reformed as Battleworld, and then was later deconstructed and returned to normal by Reed Richards. His plan was to get rid of Miles and his family, sending them back to their home reality. However, it didn't really work out when he put it into action. Still, Ultimatum could be waiting for the right moment to strike again, and also boasts of having the immensely powerful Green Goblin of Earth 1610 at his beck and call, who also came along with him to Earth 616. Number 4. The Lizard. The Lizard was originally Peter Parker in the reality of Earth 65. Peter was a friend of Gwen's and wanted nothing more than to be just like his favorite hero, Spider-Woman. He worked on a serum that would help him to become like her and also help him to stand up to the students who mistreated him, which Gwen often did for Peter whenever she noticed that he was being teased. Unfortunately, the serum did not work as Peter expected and turned him into the monster and villain known as the Lizard. A monster which Gwen, as Spider-Woman, was forced to kill, only to find out after that all along it had been her friend Peter, who'd simply turned himself into the Lizard in the first place because he wanted to be like her. Oh my goodness. It's a pretty tragic story just all around. For Gwen, for Peter, ugh. Number 3. Venom. This version of Spider-Man comes to us from what we're referring to temporarily as Earth 848. That's a temporal reality number though, so don't get too attached to it because it's probably gonna change. As implied by the name of this point, he is from the What If inspired series Spider-Man Spider's Shadow, where we imagine what would have happened if Peter hadn't decided to part ways with the symbiotic black suit we've come to know as Venom, but instead decided to stay bonded to it, basically becoming Venom. Here, Spider-Man becomes a merciless anti-hero slash villain who kills his enemies, and the Sinister Six must band together in order to try and survive. Well, a version of the Sinister Six at least. He also sports a pretty sweet beard here. Beards make you dark and edgy, right? I don't know, I've never had one, so let me know. Number 2. Black Suit Mr. Fantastic. If you thought Peter Parker keeping the black suit was a bad idea, wait till you see who else gets their hands on it on Earth TRN 848 in Spider-Man Spider's Shadow. None other than Mr. Fantastic of the Fantastic Four. Well, he isn't really intending to get his hands on it, it's more like it gets its tendrils on him after blaming Reed for causing Peter to leave it. The black symbiote suit then forcefully bonds to Reed and takes control of his brilliant mind, using it to extract its own offspring. So it's likely only going to get a lot more dark in this series before it gets any brighter. If it gets any brighter. I guess we'll see what Chip Zdarsky has in store for us. Number 1. Carnage. While we might know Aunt May's alternate spider totem persona as a hero, the one who hails from the reality of Earth 3123, Spider-Man, she also has her own dark spider alternate. We meet this version of May Riley, who goes by the mantle Carnage, in Spider-Verse issue number 2 out of 2019. Here, Spider-Man finds herself attacked by her dark alternate, Carnage, who comes through a portal into Ma'am's reality, and hails herself from Earth 20143. This version of Aunt May is instead bonded with the Carnage symbiote and believes firmly in spreading chaos and death throughout the multiverse. It takes May working in tandem with all her good counterparts across the multiverse to fight back this villainous version of herself, an alternate spider person.